On August 28, 1984, an 18-year-old girl named Elizabeth went missing. This happened in a quiet Austrian town called Amstetten, which is located about an hour west of the capital city of Vienna. On the very first day that she was gone, her friends and her family immediately felt a deep sense of worry. They knew that Elizabeth was not the type of person to just disappear without telling anyone. And so they went out into the streets to look for her. They searched all of her favorite hangouts. They checked the local parks, the shops, and the streets where she often walked. They called everyone they could think of, but nobody had seen her. The hours kept ticking by and the sun eventually went down, but there was still no sign of Elizabeth. The following day, when Elizabeth still had not shown up and no one had heard a single word from her, her parents decided they could not wait any longer. They walked into the local police station in Amstetten and they officially reported her as a missing person. The police took the report seriously and they launched an initial search of the town and all the surrounding areas. They went through the local woods, they checked nearby transit stations, and they interviewed people who might have seen her on the day she vanished. But after several weeks of intense searching, the investigators had found absolutely nothing. There was not a single piece of physical evidence, no eyewitness sightings, and nothing at all that connected to Elizabeth or where she might have gone. It was as if she had simply evaporated into thin air. Then, about a month after Elizabeth had been reported missing, her parents walked back into the police station. But this time, they were not just coming to ask for updates. They were carrying something with them. They handed the officers a note that they said they had just received in the mail. When the police looked at the envelope, they saw it was postmarked from a town that was located about 2 hours west of Amstetten. The note inside was written by Elizabeth. In this handwritten letter, Elizabeth wrote directly to her parents. She told them that she had grown incredibly tired of living with them. She said she had decided to leave and start a new life elsewhere, and she did not want them to come looking for her. She even went so far as to warn them that if she discovered they were actively searching for her, she would immediately flee the country and they would never see her again. After the police finished reading this note, they looked up at the parents. They asked them if they thought this was real. They wanted to know if this was a legitimate letter written by their daughter, or if it could be a hoax. The parents looked back at the officers and said, yes, they believed it was absolutely real. They recognized her handwriting and it seemed to match up. And then, right after that, Elizabeth's father, a man named Joseph, spoke up. He made a suggestion to the officers. Joseph said that he believed his daughter had probably run off to join some kind of religious cult. He explained to the police that this was something he had been worried about for a while. He claimed that before she disappeared, she had been showing a lot of interest in these types of groups, and he was convinced she had finally made the decision to leave her family behind to join one of them. Once the parents left the police station, the officers decided they needed to follow up on this new lead. They began conducting interviews with other family members, as well as Elizabeth's close friends and classmates. They wanted to see if anyone else had noticed her showing an interest in cults. But as they started talking to the people who actually knew Elizabeth best, they got a completely different story. Virtually everyone they spoke to said absolutely not. They told the police there was no way Elizabeth had run off to join a cult. It just was not in her character at all. They described her as a very quiet, reserved, and down-to-earth person. They had never heard her talking about a cult, nor had she ever shown interest in anything that even remotely resembled a cult. These answers left the police feeling very suspicious about the whole situation. They could not understand why the father was so quick to push this cult theory when none of Elizabeth's friends had ever heard her mention such a thing. And so, the investigators decided they needed to look much deeper into the young woman's history. They wanted to see if there was some other hidden reason why she might have wanted to run away from her home. As they researched the family, they discovered that Elizabeth was one of 7 siblings. All of them lived together in a large house with their parents, Joseph and Rosemary. From the outside, the family looked incredibly successful and respectable. Joseph was a highly accomplished electrical engineer and a local real estate developer. He was well liked by his neighbors and he was seen as a pillar of the community. His wife, Rosemary, had gotten married very young, at the age of 17, and she had stayed home to take care of the children and manage the household. By all accounts, if you were just looking at them from the street, they seemed like a very ordinary, happy, middle-class family. But as the police began to dig deeper and deeper behind closed doors, they uncovered a much darker reality. Despite his friendly and charming public persona, Joseph was actually a ruthless authoritarian when he was home alone with his family. He ruled his household with an iron fist. At night, when the sound of his car tires rolling up the driveway was heard, a wave of anxiety would wash over the entire house. The moment Joseph walked through the front door, his wife and his children would immediately stop whatever they were doing. They would go completely silent. They would try to make themselves as invisible as possible, in the desperate hope that they might avoid a beating. Joseph was incredibly violent, and his family lived in constant fear of his temper. The only member of the family who seemed willing to stand up to Joseph was Elizabeth. She was strong-willed, and she refused to let her father break her spirit. Because of this, she and Joseph would frequently get into massive, screaming fights that echoed through the house. And as punishment for these fights, Joseph would subject Elizabeth to terrible abuse. He would not only beat her, but he would also lock her in a room and prevent her from seeing her friends for long periods of time. He was incredibly controlling. He would go through her personal belongings, read her private diary, and monitor her every move. This highly toxic relationship finally came to a head 2 years prior to her most recent disappearance. In 1982, Elizabeth had actually managed to run away from home. She made it all the way to Vienna before the authorities finally caught up to her and brought her back to her father. Upon learning about this earlier runaway attempt, the police became convinced that they had their answer. They believed that this most recent disappearance was simply another attempt by Elizabeth to escape her abusive and controlling father. They figured she had successfully planned her escape this time, and she had written that note to keep them off her trail. Because of this, the police decided that the situation was essentially a private family matter. They did not see any signs of foul play, and they did not push the investigation any further. A year slowly went by, and then another. Neither the police nor Elizabeth's family heard another word from her. Eventually, her missing persons case was officially closed, and her file was archived. But then, 24 years later, a seemingly completely unconnected event occurred that would break her case wide open. On April 19, 2008, a 19-year-old girl named Kirsten was rushed to the hospital in Amstetten. Her condition was absolutely critical. When the emergency room doctors looked at her, they were deeply shocked by her appearance. Her skin was so incredibly pale that it looked almost transparent, as if she had not seen a single ray of sunlight in her entire life. She was completely unconscious, and she was suffering from severe, violent seizures. Her lungs and her kidneys were rapidly failing. The medical staff worked frantically to stabilize her, and they eventually decided that the only way to save her life was to put her into a medically induced coma. But even after they stabilized her, the doctors ran into a major obstacle. They ran a litany of tests, checking her blood, her brain activity, and her organs, but they could not figure out what was causing her to be so sick. Because they did not know the underlying cause of her condition, they were unable to treat her effectively. They began to suspect that she might be suffering from some sort of rare, undiagnosed genetic condition. To see if they could find any matching medical history, they decided to input her name into the National Medical Database. But when they typed in her name, nothing came up. Her name was completely missing from the system. This was extremely perplexing to the hospital staff because in Austria, everyone's name is registered in this medical database from the moment they are born. Confused, the doctors decided to run her name through other government databases, including birth registries and social security systems. But her name did not show up anywhere. It was as if this 19-year-old girl did not exist on paper at all. She had no birth certificate, no school records, and no medical history. She was a complete ghost. Totally baffled by this girl who seemingly did not exist, and who was exhibiting symptoms of a condition none of the doctors had ever seen before, the medical staff realized they needed to speak to the person who had brought her in. They knew that an older man was sitting out in the waiting room, and he was the one who had transported her to the hospital. When the doctors approached this older man, he identified himself as Kirsten's grandfather. But beyond giving them that basic piece of information, he offered virtually nothing else. In fact, his behavior was highly unusual and deeply concerning to the staff. He was extremely aggressive, incredibly rude, and highly dismissive of the doctor's concerns. Whenever they tried to ask him simple questions about Kirsten's daily life, her diet, or where she lived, he would answer as minimally as possible, often just grunting or giving one-word answers. When the doctors really began to press him on whether or not Kirsten had any known genetic disorders or underlying medical conditions, he refused to give them a straight answer. He just shrugged his shoulders and claimed he did not know anything about her health. But the doctors got the distinct impression that this man was lying. They felt that he knew exactly what was wrong with her, but he was choosing to keep that information to himself. This behavior absolutely shocked the medical team. They could not comprehend why a grandfather would withhold vital medical information that could potentially save his own granddaughter's life. It made no sense at all. After this disastrous and frustrating interaction in the waiting room, the doctors decided they had no choice but to get the police involved. There were simply too many red flags to ignore. A young girl with no legal existence was dying of an unknown illness, and her guardian was actively hostile and secretive. When the police arrived at the hospital, they walked into the waiting room to identify the older man. And when they saw him, they were surprised to realize that this man was none other than Joseph, the father of Elizabeth, the girl who had gone missing 24 years earlier. The police sat down with Joseph and asked him to explain exactly what was going on. Joseph looked at the officers and spun a highly bizarre story. He told them that earlier that day, he had been inside his house when he heard a strange noise outside. He went to his front door, opened it, and there, lying unconscious on his front step, was a young girl he had never seen before in his life. That girl was Kirsten. Joseph claimed that lying on top of Kirsten's body was a handwritten note from his long-lost daughter, Elizabeth. In this note, Elizabeth allegedly wrote directly to Joseph. She told him that the girl lying on the step was her daughter, Kirsten, which meant she was Joseph's granddaughter. The note went on to say that Kirsten was extremely sick and that Elizabeth was completely unable to take care of her anymore. She begged Joseph and Rosemary to take the girl to the hospital and get her the medical help she desperately needed. While the police had an absolute mountain of questions about this incredibly strange and highly convenient turn of events, they realized they had to prioritize saving Kirsten's life. The doctors were still completely in the dark about her illness, and they needed to find Elizabeth immediately so she could provide them with Kirsten's medical history. The police decided to go to the media. They put out a massive urgent appeal on television and radio stations across the country. It was a direct message to Elizabeth, pleading with her to come forward. The broadcast essentially said, "We do not care about your past or why you ran away. We just need you to contact us as soon as possible so we can find out what is wrong with your daughter and save her life." The media campaign was incredibly widespread, and it did not take long to produce a result. Just 1 week after the appeal was launched, Elizabeth suddenly showed up at the hospital where Kirsten was being treated. And she was not alone. She was walking side by side with her father, Joseph. When the doctors and the police saw them arrive, they asked Joseph how he had managed to locate his missing daughter so quickly. But Joseph remained evasive. He did not get into any specific details about how or where he had found her. He simply told them that he had managed to make contact with her, and now she was here because she wanted to see her sick daughter. As the medical staff looked at Elizabeth, they were deeply unsettled by her appearance. According to her birth records, Elizabeth was supposed to be in her early 40s. But as she stood before them, she looked like she could easily be in her late 60s or 70s. Her hair was completely stark white. Her skin was incredibly pale and almost transparent, exhibiting the exact same unnatural complexion that they had observed on her daughter Kirsten. After checking in at the front desk, Joseph and Elizabeth began making their way down the long hospital corridor toward Kirsten's room. The doctors who were present in the room when the pair walked in would later state that Elizabeth looked absolutely terrified. She was hunched over, slouching down as if she wanted to disappear, and she completely refused to make eye contact with any of the medical staff. She stood by the bedside, looking down at her terribly ill daughter. The doctors gently began to ask her questions. They asked if she knew of any family medical history, or any specific health problems that Kirsten might have been born with, so they could treat her more effectively. But Elizabeth was so visibly shaken and terrified that she could not even speak. She stood there trembling, her eyes darting around the room. At some point, the pressure of the questions and the presence of the doctors became completely overwhelming for her. She suddenly turned around and walked out of the room, stepping into the hallway. Joseph immediately followed her out. But the moment they stepped into the corridor, they found themselves surrounded by police officers. The medical staff had tipped off the police the moment Joseph and Elizabeth had walked into the building. The officers immediately detained both of them, separated them, and drove them to the police station for questioning. They put Elizabeth and Joseph into 2 separate, isolated interrogation rooms. The detectives decided to interview Elizabeth first. But when they sat down across from her, she was completely mute, just as she had been in the hospital room. She stared down at her lap, refusing to say a word. For 5 grueling hours, the police grilled her with questions. They asked her where she had been for the last 24 years. They asked her what had happened to Kirsten and if she had played some role in her daughter's severe illness. They kept reminding her, over and over again, that Kirsten was currently fighting for her life in a coma. They told her that if she refused to give them the information they needed to save her, and if something terrible happened to Kirsten, she could be held criminally liable for her daughter's death. Finally, after hours of silence, the weight of the situation became too much for Elizabeth to bear. She looked up at the detectives. In a very small, weak, and trembling voice, she said, "Okay, I will tell you the entire story, but you have to make me a promise first. You must promise me that I will never, ever have to see my father, Joseph, again for the rest of my life." When she said this, the detectives could see the sheer, absolute terror in her eyes. They realized that she was not running from the law, she was running from him. They immediately agreed. They told her, "We promise you, you will never have to see your father again. We will make sure of it. Now, please tell us what happened." Elizabeth clutched her hands together in her lap. She took a very deep breath, and then she began to tell them one of the most horrifying and disturbing stories the police had ever heard in their entire lives. It was a story so shocking that it would make massive headlines all around the world for months. She told them that it all began 24 years earlier on August 28, 1984, the exact day she went missing. On that afternoon, she was at her family home in Amstetten. Her father, Joseph, came up to her and asked her to come down into the basement to help him carry some heavy metal doors. He explained that he was finally finishing up the construction of a bomb shelter that he had been working on for the last several years. At the time, in the early 1980s, the Cold War was still very active and tension was high. Because of this, it was relatively common for homeowners in Austria to construct bomb shelters inside their basements. And so, Elizabeth did not suspect anything unusual. She followed her father down the stairs into the basement. She saw Joseph standing in front of an empty concrete door frame that led into the shelter area. He asked her to step through the frame and hold the heavy door from the inside so he could secure the hinges from the outside. Elizabeth complied. She stepped through the frame into the dark room, turned around, and took hold of the door. But the moment the door was aligned, Joseph suddenly and violently swung it open, knocking Elizabeth backward onto the concrete floor. Before she could process what was happening or try to stand back up, Joseph rushed into the room. He grabbed her and pressed a towel that was heavily soaked in chemical ether onto her face. Elizabeth fought back, but the chemical fumes quickly overwhelmed her and she lost consciousness. When she finally came to, she found herself in pitch darkness. She tried to move, but she immediately heard the clinking of metal. She was chained up by her ankle to a concrete post in the very back room of the shelter. It would turn out that this bomb shelter, which Joseph had spent 6 years carefully designing and constructing, was not a bomb shelter at all. It was a custom-built underground prison that he had designed specifically to keep Elizabeth trapped for the rest of her life. To access this secret dungeon, you had to go down the regular stairs into the basement, which looked like a typical unfinished basement with concrete walls. On the far wall, there were several large wooden shelves filled with typical household items like paint cans, screwdrivers, hammers, and other tools. But if you walked over to the left side of these shelves, there was a hidden mechanical lock on the back of the wood. If you unlocked it, the entire massive shelving unit would swing outward like a door. Behind the shelves was a thick concrete wall, and embedded in that wall was a small 3-foot-tall concrete door. This door was secured by a highly advanced electronic keypad lock. Because Joseph was a brilliant electrical engineer, he had personally wired and programmed this lock himself. He designed it with multiple backup power supplies and safety overrides so that it could never be tampered with, destroyed, or opened by anyone else. Only Joseph knew the secret code. When Joseph entered his code into the keypad, the heavy concrete door would swing open, revealing a small, crawl space-like opening. If you crawled through that opening, you would enter into a secret underground prison that was essentially a winding, claustrophobic maze of small rooms. The ceilings throughout the entire structure were incredibly low, measuring less than 5 feet high, meaning that anyone inside was forced to constantly hunch over or crawl. You could never stand up straight. If you walked through the secret entrance, you would first enter a long, narrow, soundproofed hallway. At the end of this hallway was a tiny, incredibly cramped bathroom area. There were no doors for privacy. If you continued past the bathroom, you would walk through another soundproofed corridor that led into a tiny, windowless bedroom that barely had enough space to contain a single mattress. Off to the right of that room was another door leading to a second, similarly sized room. All of the walls, floors, and ceilings of this underground dungeon were made of thick, reinforced concrete. Joseph had also spent years installing professional-grade, soundproofing material throughout the entire structure. This meant that no matter how loud Elizabeth screamed or how hard she banged on the walls, not a single sound could ever reach the house above or the neighbors outside. Furthermore, Joseph had installed a network of security cameras and microphones connected to a monitor in his private office upstairs. He could watch and listen to Elizabeth's every move, ensuring she had absolutely zero privacy and no chance of escaping. For the first 5 years of her confinement, Elizabeth lived in complete and utter isolation in that dark, cold dungeon. Her only connection to the living world was her father. Joseph would come down the stairs almost every single night, carrying basic supplies like food, water, and hygiene products. But every night he came down, he would subject her to horrific physical and sexual abuse. Upstairs, Joseph's wife, Rosemary, and his other children had absolutely no idea what was happening. Whenever they asked why Joseph spent so many hours in the basement, he would simply tell them that he was working on complex engineering projects and that he was never to be disturbed. His violent temper ensured that no one ever dared to question him or go down to look. Then, in 1988, Elizabeth discovered that she was pregnant with her father's child. She was absolutely terrified and begged Joseph to let her go to a hospital to deliver the baby, but he completely refused. He was not willing to risk his secret being exposed. Instead, he went upstairs, bought a medical book on childbirth, and brought it down to her along with a pair of scissors to cut the umbilical cord. He threw the items on her bed and told her good luck. On August 30th, 1988, Elizabeth gave birth to her daughter, Kirsten, completely alone on the concrete floor of her prison. Over the next several years, Elizabeth would go on to deliver